This week at the box office, Captain Marvel is number 1 for the second weekend in a row, while a slate of new releases all outperform expectations. We also welcome Christopher Schiller back to the show to find his missing guest segment, and to talk to us about Disney's reconciliation with Director James Gunn. All this and more on this episode of The Weekend Take.
You're listening to The Weekend Take, and now your host, Sean Schaefer.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Weekend Take. I'm your host, Sean Schaefer. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, our originally slated special guest, Rich Lounello, will not be able to join us this week. But we will be welcoming back to the show Christopher Schiller to discuss the James Gunn and Disney situation with us a bit later in the show. For those of you new to the show, The Weekend Take is a weekly podcast that breaks down the weekend box office results, but looks beyond the numbers at the current topics and trends of the film industry. Let's get started the way we do every week by looking at the films that left the top 10. This week there were 4 films that left the top 10, starting with Greta from Focus Features, which dropped from the number 8 position down to number 16. Greta took in $675,000, a near 70% drop from last week. The film lost over 1,400 screens, losing 1,437 screens to bring its count down to 980. It had a $689 per screen average to bring its cume to $10 million in its third week of release. The second film to leave the top 10 this week was Fighting With My Family from MGM, which dropped from the number 9 position down to number 13. Fighting With My Family took in $1.1 million, a 49% drop from last week. The film lost about a third of its screens, losing 875 screens to bring its count down to 1,580. It had a $702 per screen average to bring its cume up to $20.9 million in its fifth week of release. Next up was Apollo 11 from Neon, which dropped from the number 10 position down to number 12. Apollo 11 took in $1.2 million, only a 2% drop from last week. However, it gained 183 screens to bring its count up to 588. It touted a $2,085 per screen average and has brought its cume up to $5.5 million in its third week of release. And lastly, to leave the top 10 is Isn't It Romantic from Warner Brothers, which dropped from the number 7 position down to number 11. Isn't It Romantic took in $1.26 million, a 44% drop from last week. It lost 857 screens to bring its count down to 1,366. It had a per-screen average of $926 and has brought its cume up to $46.3 million in its fifth week of release. Now, surprisingly, I'm not always the most accurate when I make these predictions, but last week I did predict that possibly all 4 of these films would be the ones that suffer the fate of leaving the top 10. The most surprising of which, though, out of the 4 of them, for me, is Apollo 11, which I knew was going to get a further expansion this week, as it gained 183 screens and still had a decent per-screen average of just over $2,000. However, the decline in that per-screen average, combined with only being in 588 screens, means that its cume was just shy of making it into the top 10, which we'll get into a moment, as Green Book was at $1.27 million, whereas Apollo 11 was at $1.22. When the actual numbers come out on Monday, it's possible that Apollo 11 may sneak its way back into the top 10, possibly even Isn't It Romantic, as it's such a tight race to call when looking at the number 10, 11, and 12 positions after the weekend estimates. Green Book, which we'll talk about in a moment, at number 10 is at $1.277 million. The current estimated number 11, Isn't It Romantic, is at $1.265 million. Only a $12,000 difference between those two. And then Apollo 11 at number 12 is at $1.226 million. Only $40,000 less than Isn't It Romantic, and only $51,000 less than Green Book. So it's possible when the actual numbers come out, taking all the ticket sales into account for Sunday, we could see a bit of a shakeup in the 10, 11, and 12 positions.
Number 10.
And speaking of number 10, let's start our countdown with number 10. This week, Green Book from Universal is at number 10, down from the number 6 position, taking in $1.2 million, a 49% drop from last week. The film lost 777 screens to bring its count down to 1,320 screens, a $967 per screen average, as it brings its cume up to $82.6 million in its 18th week of release on a $23 million budget. So for the Academy Award winner for Best Picture, the post-Oscar glow has all but dissipated as it finds itself clinging to the number 10 position this week, and possibly once the actuals come out, it may find itself ultimately in the number 11 or even 12 position. But after 18 weeks of release, Green Book has had a formidable run. $82.6 million domestically, combined with its foreign gross of $192 million, brings its worldwide total to $274.6 million. Considering it's only on a $23 million budget, that is a huge victory for Universal and the film. Not much more to say about the film that 3 Academy Awards don't already speak volumes for. Green Book, as I mentioned, winning Best Picture, also winning Best Supporting Actor for Mahershala Ali, and winning Best Original Screenplay. I imagine this time next week that we'll be reporting about Green Book leaving the top 10, but after such a lengthy and successful run at the box office and at the awards season, this film certainly ends on a high note.
Number 9.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 9, down from number 5 this week, is Alita, Battle Angel from Fox, which took in $1.9 million, a 41% drop from last week. The film lost 678 screens to bring its count down to 1,696, a just over $1,100 per screen average, as it brings its cume up to $81.8 million in its 5th week of release, on a $170 million budget. For Alita Battle Angel from Fox, it is possible that the film hangs in the top 10 for one more week, as there's only one new wide release to speak of next week, being Jordan Peele's Us. That, combined with the anticipated performances of the 4 releases that came out this week in their respective second weeks of release, it is possible that Alita hangs into the number 9 or number 10 position next week, which I'm personally rooting for, as I'm a big fan of the film. I went and gave it a second viewing this past weekend with my wife, who hadn't previously seen the film, and was just as mesmerized and entertained by it the second time as I was the first time. I think that the performances are there. I think the story offers something. I think the visual effects are stunning. And I think as a film, it's well put together. It strikes a good balance of style and substance. Now, that's not to say it's an incredible script. And it's also not to say that the visuals are beyond anything I've ever seen. But it strikes just the right balance in both of those metrics to make the film entertaining and enjoyable. And even my wife came out of the film saying how awesome the film was and how great of a character Alita was, with no prior knowledge of the anime or manga. All this only helps to further my personal petition to hope that Fox sees the potential in this film as a franchise and greenlights a sequel for the film, despite its poor domestic box office performance. When looking at it, $81.8 million versus a $170 million budget is not a positive sign at all. But looking at the foreign gross, which currently stands at $312 million to bring the film's worldwide gross up to $394 million and will likely top $400 million before its run is over, it's hard to argue that the film is a success worldwide. And it's hard to argue against the possibility of having a sequel. Over the past few weeks of Alita's release, I'd been making the comparisons between Alita and Pacific Rim, both of which are futuristic, sci-fi, heavy CGI films with a lot of visual pyrotechnics. And I'd been making the case that Alita finds itself in the same boat as the original Pacific Rim found itself, in that it was a big budgeted film that did not so well domestically, but with foreign gross taken into account, achieved a level of profit just enough to warrant a sequel. So to put a more direct comparison between the two, Alita has a budget of $170 million, and so far has made $394 million worldwide. And by the end of its run, I imagine it'll cross $400 million. By comparison, Pacific Rim had a $190 million budget, $20 million more than Alita. Domestically, it did $101.8 million, and its worldwide gross was $411 million. Even comparing the two, if Alita ended its run today, Alita would have only made $17 million less than Pacific Rim did its entire run, but Alita also cost $20 million less to make. It's easy to see how it'd be dumb of Fox not to greenlight a sequel for Alita. $400 million is $400 million any way you cut it. And if they have a problem with $400 million, I will gladly take $400 million off of Fox's hands. But looking ahead for Alita as it enters its 6th week in release, it should still hang on to a spot in the top 10. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It will really depend on what the theater count looks like and how many screens it loses heading into next weekend. But either way, this is a film you need to check out, preferably on the biggest screen that you can, with the best sound system that you can, before it leaves theaters and moves on to home video and streaming.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks. Number 8.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 8, Down from number 4 this week is the Lego Movie 2, the second part from Warner Brothers, which took in $2.1 million, a 44.8% drop from last week. The film lost nearly a third of its screens, losing 884 screens to bring its count down to 2,046. It still averaged just over $1,000 per screen to bring its cume up to $101.3 million in its 6th week of release. So for the Lego Movie, it beat my expectations. I didn't anticipate this film crossing $100 million domestically. It's done that, and it'll do a little bit more. But given the current market saturation of family-friendly CGI films, looking at this week's release of Wonder Park and the current release of How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World, Lego Movie 2 is the oldest of these 3 films, and therefore, like I mentioned last week, has the most to lose from that market saturation. I do believe that if anything's going to leave the top 10 this week outside of Green Book after its lengthy theatrical run, it's going to be the Lego Movie 2. I know last week I compared where Lego Movie 2 was to the 2 previous films of the Lego universe, and I'm going to look at them again quickly this week. Lego Movie 2, after 38 days of release, is at $101.3 million, as I mentioned. By comparison, the original Lego Movie, after 38 days in release, was at $236.9 million, meaning that the Lego Movie 2 is $135 million behind where the original Lego Movie was at this point. And even looking at Lego Batman, which at 38 days of release was at $167.3 million, that means that Lego Movie 2 is $66 million behind Lego Batman at this point in the release. And unfortunately also for the Lego Movie 2 is that its worldwide gross isn't much to shake a stick at either. Currently, the Lego Movie 2 has only a $70.1 million foreign gross. And by comparison again, looking at the other 2 films, the Lego Movie, the original, made $211 million foreign gross. That's 3 times as much. And even Lego Batman made $136 million in the foreign gross, which is nearly twice as much as Lego Movie 2. So when all said and done, Lego Movie 2's $171 million worldwide gross is a far cry from the $469 and $311 million worldwide grosses of the original Lego Movie and Lego Batman. And by contrast, versus what the film we were just talking about, Alita Battle Angel, those numbers for Lego Movie 2 do not warrant a third film to complete the trilogy, because Lego Movie 2, made on a $100 million budget and only taking in $171 million worldwide by Hollywood math, means it's losing Warner Brothers roughly $80 million currently. Usually a film has to make 2.5 times its reported budget for a studio to consider it break even. By that math, Lego Movie 2 with a $100 million budget means it would have to have made $250 million worldwide to reach a break-even point for Warner Brothers. It's not going to reach that. And so I think Warner Brothers has an easy decision to make, just like Fox has an easy decision to make a sequel to Alita, to not make a sequel to Lego Movie 2. But I could be wrong, as one of the main driving forces of Lego Movie is in the merchandising and the toys. And given that Lego is such a long-standing popular toy with the demographic that the movie also caters to, who's to say that the merchandise isn't enough to make a third film? All in all, for the Lego Movie 2, I just think there was too much competition and too much franchise fatigue to warrant Lego Movie 2 being as successful as the predecessors. But I would still certainly suggest checking it out when it comes to home video or streaming.
Number 7.
Moving on in the countdown now, we're up to number 7, and it's the first of our new releases this week, Captive State from Focus Features, taking in $3.1 million on 2,548 screens, a $1,241 per screen average, which is not the biggest number to be putting up your opening weekend. The sci-fi film, which looks at the city of Chicago 10 years following occupation of the city and most of the world by an extraterrestrial force and the rebellious factions that look to rise up against it, didn't seem to strike with audiences across the board. You look at the numbers and the grades. On CinemaScore, Captive State had a C-, and on Rotten Tomatoes, it had a 49%. So the audiences being polled leaving the film, not very high on the film. I mean, a C- is certainly not a good grade. And the critics aren't riding high on the film either, with only a 49%, which outside of Medea, Family Funeral, and Wonder Park is the lowest critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes in the top 10. When looking at CinemaScore, Captive State is the lowest grade in the top 10 as well. And given the low per-screen average of $1,241 and the very front-heavy nature of the interest in the film here in its opening weekend, I would expect to see Captive State leave the top 10 next week with an over 60% drop. For Focus Features, this was a shot that they took and missed.
Number 6.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 6, and it's our second new release of the week. No Manches Frida 2 from Pantelion, taking in $3.9 million on 472 screens, a massive $8,250 per screen in its opening weekend. Now, No Manches Frida 2 from Pantelion, which is a division of Lionsgate, tells the story of a seemingly reformed ex-con who's about to marry the love of his life, the lovable nerdy Lucy. However, when wedding day jitters turn into a full-blown fiasco, Lucy calls the wedding off. Meanwhile, the school finds itself in deep trouble and the gang heads to the water to compete in the tournament of their lives. Once they're all seaside, Lucy runs into her high school sweetheart Mario, whom since she last saw him is transformed into a smoking hot hunk. He's the coach of the opposing squad, and our hero finds himself a rival in more than just one competition. Now he has to pull out all the stops to wrangle in his rowdy kids, win Lucy back, and in case that wasn't enough, save the school from shutting down by leading Frida High to victory. Beyond the synopsis, I don't know too much about No Manches Frida 2. But over $8,200 per screen is hard to argue with. And when compared to the first film, which did $3.6 million on 362 screens back in 2016, averaging over $10,000 per screen, it shows that there's certainly audience interest in it. That film went on to make $11.5 million in its total run, which ran for about 9 weeks in theaters. If No Manches Frida 2 follows a similar path, despite being a little bit smaller of an opening and a smaller per-screen average, I'd imagine this film will probably wind up around the $10 million mark as well. But the best thing to see coming out of this from No Manches Frida 2 is to see more diversity, and particularly with a foreign language film in the top 10, appealing to the masses the way that it does. Films like this, which previously would have only catered to a smaller, more directed demographic, prove that films that are meant to be marketed to a smaller demographic can have much broader appeal.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
So now we've reached the portion of the show where we would take it aside to get to know our special guests a little better. As I mentioned at the top of the show, due to technical difficulties, Rich Lounello was unable to join us, but stepping in to join us as an extra special guest this week is Christopher Schiller, who's writer, director, producer, entertainment attorney, and columnist for Script Magazine. You may remember Chris as our first special guest on The Weekend Take in our first episode, but due to the learning curve of the show and the change in format and the baby steps of the show, Chris was unable to get his special guest segment as all of our guests since him have. So here he is today for a bit of redemption, I'd say, and to get his special guest segment. Chris, thanks for stepping in and helping out. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Better late than never, I guess.
Well, we certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure being the surprise guest on today's show is just as much of a surprise to you as it is to all of our listeners.
Definitely was a surprise, but I'm happy to pitch in. Always have a lot to say about the films and the movie-making process, so I'm happy to help out.
Chris, as I mentioned, you're a writer, director, producer, entertainment attorney, and columnist for Script Magazine. Now, since you were on the show, your article that were discussing on the show has come out when we were discussing Bird Box and choosing the right format for your film when looking at exhibition. Have you had other articles released since then that you could tell the folks about?
Yes, just a day or so ago, I published a new article about throwing in the towel. When to know how to do it and how to do it properly so it doesn't come back and slap you in the face.
Great. That's awesome to hear, and I'll be sure to put pertinent links to everything in the episode description below. Tell the folks at home a little bit more about yourself and what you do and kind of guess your journey to this point.
Okay. Well, it's a long and winding road, as quite a number of people probably have the similar style of story. It started out a long time ago in broadcast news and learned as much as I could on the technical end of that kind of production structure. Got very good at a whole bunch of things and was often answering questions about what ended up being legal aspects. And because I had an inquisitive mind and figured it out on my own, I was often answering those questions for others, decided, well, let me turn around and go to law school and get the entertainment law under my belt so that I can answer those questions and actually get paid for it. And so I took the route to interrupt my career for a few years, go to law school in Los Angeles. I went to Southwestern School of Law, got the degree, became a New York attorney, and was able to parlay all that into a viable working entertainment practice and keep my hand in the production side of things as well. So I've got a few projects that I've produced, a few things that I've created myself. I'm currently producing a documentary film that you may be aware of.
Yep.
It's a whole bunch of irons in the fire, but as long as I keep everything moving and people haven't gotten tired of me doing one thing, I can move to another. Because of that diversity of interests, I was approached to start writing a column about the business and legal aspects of the film industry from a screenwriting perspective predominantly. And that has been going on at scriptmag.com for almost 6 years. So I've been putting it out there and answering questions, and I love to be a resource to be used to make things better for everyone who's trying to struggle through this industry and make things work for themselves.
In this article that you've just released about throwing in the towel, now, is it with regards to a screenwriter or just any person in the film industry that may be considering it?
I try to at least be tangentially attached to the screenwriting perspective, but I also branch out into writing articles that could be understood by independent filmmakers that are approaching things, people approaching a film from a script perspective, be it a narrative or a documentary. I try and stay as broad a topic as possible, and the starting point is always scripts. And so in this particular case, I used a lot of examples about writing scripts and knowing when that script is not going to go forward all the way. Understanding, if you've got a script that's based on some event that loses its notoriety or factors change dramatically, and so the script is no longer something that is dying to hit the screens just by matter of time passed, and it's no longer a viable project. So the article is an approach to how to listen for that, how to take that in and recognize it as, if every road is leading uphill, then maybe you're not going to get out of that rut, and you can set it aside and move forward to the next one. The entire spectrum of creative endeavors can benefit from most of the articles I write, and I just try to take that approach and push it forward, and people seem to like it. I get lots of good feedback from the articles I write, and I get ideas for the next one, often from people who are responding to previous things that I've done. As long as I keep thinking of things to write about, I'll keep writing those columns. So keep reading them.
Now, as a writer, director, and producer yourself, you said you've created your own pieces, one of which I worked with you on, which was Key Transitions.
Mm-hmm.
Wearing so many hats, is there one in particular that you favor?
I most enjoy writing because it is the place where I can do my most creative without the boundaries of limitation. I really enjoy directing when I'm able to assist people to reach their potentials. You don't always have the time you need in a director's chair or the money you need in a director's chair to be able to get everything that's possibly there. When you're sitting behind a keyboard and nobody's expecting the spec script that you're writing, you can take your time. I've got scripts that I'm really enthused about that I've been working on for years, and there's other pieces of work that I can knock out in a few days and I'm just as proud of. I'm not limited by the time frame. I'm not limited by production structure or schedules to get certain things out the door. I find writing is almost cathartic. I get to express a unique perspective, and that's my go-to. That said, I'm currently producing a documentary film where I am taking the facilitator role as a producer, where the lead producer director is running with his ideas as to where he wants to take the documentary. And I am providing that facilitation, trying to figure out how to get him where he needs to be able to successfully get those. And that's just as fulfilling. It's just in a different perspective. Every role that I've done in my career has a good and useful and targeted thing that I really enjoy. And every one of those roles I relish when I get to serve in them. There's a saying that I heard and kind of gleamed onto, is that if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. You want to be surrounded by people that are smarter than you, that can figure out the problems that they're in charge of so that you don't have to come up with every solution. And once you find those people, you keep bringing them back on board because they've proven themselves that they're not only smart and can figure things out, but also like to work with you and figured out how to work with you. There's a simpatico relationship going as a collaborative group forward with a lot of these filmmakers who use the same cinematographer all the time. You have cinematographers who use the same crew when they go out on sets. And it's not because they're trying to be old boyish and always use the same networks. These people work. This works.
I know that you regularly visit some film festivals, particularly Telluride Film Festival, correct?
That is correct. I'm an annual attendee, including this year. I was lucky enough to get my passes before they sold out.
Any particular reason why Telluride specifically, or as opposed to, say, Toronto or South by Southwest?
Every successful film festival has an ability to find its voice. And when you find a voice that speaks the same way that you like films, you're attracted to go to that festival. And especially if it's run by people who really are passionate about films and filmmakers, then you find that connection. I found that with a few film festivals in the past. And because of a familial tie with the town of Telluride, I was aware of its probably a lot earlier than most of the listeners about its cachet in the place to watch films is always a place of cinematic reverence. And it's hard to be in a grumpy mood when you step out of a theater and look up at the Rocky Mountains in such a serene environment. And the approach that they take is we are looking for the best films out there. And that's what we bring. And we bring very few of them. Telluride's usual take in is maybe 24 of the brand new films. They also bring in a whole bunch of the restored classics, the silent films and the films that haven't been seen in a long time. And so it's got that dichotomy of attraction. It's picked the cream of the crop to show. In the manner of the 4 days of the festival, you see the best films that are there. And so just the quality of the town, the quality of the films, and the atmosphere they create to present those films is all attractive to me. And there are a number of other film festivals that find a niche that defines them as a festival. They're not just a place to go see movies. There's something about the festival that has a character on its own. And finding a character of a film festival that matches what you're looking for as a film viewer, that's a marriage that can't be dictated. You have to find it on your own and gravitate to the ones that attract you. Telluride does it for me. I'm sure that Venice does it for others. Cannes would do it for some who can afford to get to France and see the cream of the crop in its nascent form. To summarize, I think that Telluride has, for me, been the ideal connection of what I'm looking for in a film festival. And I think that everyone has to find that ideal film festival for themselves. I found mine. I tell people to go find theirs. And I know some people who love to go to Sundance. Me, not so much. But everybody has their own flavors. And I think that's something you need to find as a film goer, is to understand what your tastes are and find things that cater to those tastes best, and you'll be happy.
Looking ahead in 2019 now, what is on your plate for 2019, either as a writer, a director, a producer? What can we expect coming over the horizon for you?
The documentary that I'm working on is the one solid project that's got a timeline and an end date where it will be finished and out the door within a year's time from now. There are quite a number of other projects I have in process. I have several scripts in development. I just recently finished writing a pilot script that may or may not go into production in some form during this next year. And I've got feature films scripts that are kicking around in the hands of producers, being weighed whether or not they're willing to put the dedication and financial resources behind taking it to the next stage. Like I said earlier on, having as many irons in the fire and having them in different places in the fire so that they're all at different levels of investment of time and energy and ability to take it to the next stage. And I'm always open to jump on board other people's projects when there's an opportunity that I can bring something to the table that will make things better and move things forward. If I see the opportunity to move forward, it might be the right next thing.
And of course, I imagine there'll be more articles for Script Magazine in 2019 from you as well.
Absolutely. Every time I come up with a new cool idea to write about something, or something needs to be written about to help clarify the air, you'll see them pop up. And hopefully you people will like to read them and give me feedback as to what I might want to pursue next time.
If someone wants to connect with you and reach out to you or connect via social media, how's best one could get in touch with you or look at some of your work?
I'm pretty accessible. Christopher Schiller is usually the key word you need to look for, either on any social media platform I use. I don't hide behind anything else. My production company is called Bright Idea, BRITIDA.com. I'm available on all the normal social media structures. You can also read my column at scriptmag.com. You can search for my name there. Just I'm accessible through those medium, and people seem to listen to my rants and follow me on Twitter at Chris Schiller on Twitter. I may not be as active on some of them as others, but you could find me in any one of them.
Thank you for taking the last minute call to step in and be able to, as I mentioned, redeem yourself for not being able to do your guest segment in our first episode because we hadn't quite found our footing in our format yet.
Yeah, I find that this podcast will evolve over time. And as you get more and more attuned to what works and what doesn't and what appeals to you and your listenership, you'll find the heart of exactly how to do this. And I'm glad that you're enjoying it and moving forward with it, and the audience is building. I'm happy to be a participant.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I'm going to get back to the countdown now, but we will be touching base shortly again in the episode to discuss James Gunn, which I know you mentioned you have lots to say on that matter. So
I do.
So I will see you just a little bit later in the countdown.
Cool.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks. Number 5.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 5. Down from number 3 this week is Tyler Perry's A Medea Family Funeral from Lionsgate, which took in just under $8.1 million, a 35% drop from last week. The film only lost 92 screens, bringing its count down to 2,350, but is still averaging over $3,400 per screen and has brought its cume up to $59 million in its third week of release. Now, for A Medea Family Funeral, which is advertised as the final film Tyler Perry's doing as the Medea character, it finds itself currently smack in the middle of the pack of the 9 Medea films, which last week I had predicted it would land itself around the number 4 or 5 position. At $59 million, it only finds itself $31 million behind Tyler Perry's Medea Goes to Jail, which currently sits atop the mountain of the Medea franchise. But given the small increments between the number 5 and 4 position, and then 3, and then number 2, it's not outside the realm of possibility that Medea Family Funeral could find itself finishing its run as the number 2 grossing Medea film of the franchise. Just looking at the numbers, A Medea Family Funeral at $59 million is only $4 million behind Medea's Family Reunion, which is the number 4 film in the franchise. It's only $6 million behind Medea's Witness Protection at $65 million, which is the number 3 in the franchise, and is only $14 million behind Boo, A Medea Halloween at $73 million. I imagine this film will continue to see smaller incremental drops week over week, and that by the end of its run, I would fathom a guess that the film will end up around the $75 million mark and find itself finishing not on a high note, but certainly a profitable one, and beating the franchise average of $61.7 million. And with numbers like that, if I'm Tyler Perry, I have to begin to question whether it really is the right time to hang up the fat suit, because Medea Family Funeral proves there's still plenty of audience interest in everyone's favorite foul-mouthed grandmother.
Number 4.
Moving on in the countdown now, we're up to number 4. Down from number 2 this week is How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World from Universal, which took in $9.3 million, a 36% drop from last week. The film only lost 315 screens to bring its count down to 3,727 screens, a over $2,500 per screen average, as it brings its cume up to $135.6 million in its 4th week of release, on a $129 million budget. And much like we did with the Lego Movie, when comparing it to its predecessors, we do the same with How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World, which started off with a franchise best opening weekend of $57.5 million, but has since cooled off rather quickly, as currently, after 24 days in release, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World is at $135.6 million. At this point in its run, the original How to Train Your Dragon was at $158.2 million, and How to Train Your Dragon 2 was at $140.2 million. There's a bit of a different story, though, when looking at the worldwide numbers, especially when compared with the budget. How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World has the lowest price tag of any of the 3 films. The first film cost $165 million to make, the second $145 million to make, whereas How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World looks at a price tag of $129 million. And when taking that number into account, given its worldwide gross, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World currently sits at $466.5 million. So the film is already profitable. But that number is not too far behind the $494 million that the original How to Train Your Dragon made worldwide. However, it still finds itself miles away from How to Train Your Dragon 2, which took in a staggering $621.5 million worldwide. In fact, the second film's foreign gross almost matches the entire worldwide gross of the third film, as How to Train Your Dragon 2 made $444.5 million just in foreign gross. Now, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World is still far from ending its theatrical run, and maybe by the end of its theatrical run worldwide, could reach the numbers of the first film at $494.8 million, but that remains to be seen. Either way, much like the Medea franchise, How to Train Your Dragon 3 will end on a profitable note, but not necessarily a high note. But it still is a great film with a lot of heart, and I highly recommend you take your kids to see it. This one I would see in theaters and not wait for home video or Netflix the way I would for Lego Movie 2, given that How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World incorporates so many stunning visuals into the landscape, the characters, the dragons, and the worlds they create. This is something to see on the big screen.
Number 3.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 3, and it's our third new release of the week, 5 Feet Apart from Lionsgate, which took in $13.1 million on 2,803 screens, a per-screen average of just under $4,700. 5 Feet Apart, the drama from Lionsgate, which tells the story of a pair of teenagers with life-threatening illnesses who meet in a hospital and fall in love, stars Cole Sprouse, which the current generation will recognize as Jughead from CW's Riverdale, but people who are a little bit older will recognize Cole from the antics that he and his brother Dylan got into on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody and The Sweet Life on Deck. So to see Cole Sprouse playing such a dramatic role outside of the dark world that CW's created around the Riverdale and Archie Comics franchise is a bit of a welcome turn for him. And what makes this better is that they've paired him with such a strong co-star in Haley Lou Richardson, who most people will know from Split and The Edge of 17. I feel like the pairing of these two and the chemistry shown in the trailer make this one to check out. For me, not so much in theaters, but definitely something I'll check out on Netflix in the months to come. It had a strong opening weekend of $13.1 million, which was above industry expectations for sure, and a near $4,700 per screen average is certainly admirable. But it'll be interesting to see if this film's interest is as front-heavy as Captive State, and whether the next week this film takes the typical 50% hit, or if word of mouth holds it up to take a smaller second weekend drop, or if the interest is really that front-heavy, if this film will take a more steep drop leading into its second weekend of release. However, for 5 Feet Apart, given that the budget was reported to only have been $7 million, and having a $13.1 million opening weekend means no matter what happens next weekend, Lionsgate is looking at profit from this film. But for Haley Lee Richardson, this is just another feather in her cap, and for Cole Sprouse, this gives him the opportunity to prove that he can be a leading man on the big screen, as well as the small screen.
Number 2.
Moving on to the countdown now, we're up to number 2. It's our final new release of the week, Wonder Park from Paramount, which took in $16 million on 3,838 screens, a near $4,200 per screen average its opening weekend. Now for Wonder Park, it certainly has the challenge of coming into what is already a saturated market, as I mentioned earlier when discussing Lego Movie 2, as in the top 10 alone, there are already 2 prominent family-friendly CGI animated films, both of which are parts of successful franchises, whereas Wonder Park is its own standalone feature. And those problems are only compounded by the fact that despite a $16 million opening weekend, which was above expectations from the industry, the film still has a reported budget of between $80 and $100 million. This looks like it could be a problem for Paramount in terms of profit and loss. Even if the budget's at the low end of that number, $80 million, even if it takes a nominal hit of, say, 40% next week, that still brings its second weekend to $10 million. Combine that with the Monday through Thursday take, the film's looking at about $30 million domestic after 10 days of release. Another challenge for Wonder Park, both in its opening weekend and moving forward, is its less than stellar scores on both CinemaScore and Rotten Tomatoes. Currently, the film only has a B+ rating on CinemaScore and a 30% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics. So if the word of mouth about Wonder Park isn't entirely positive, it may have a short but rough road ahead. I wouldn't be surprised if next week, Wonder Park's second weekend puts it below How to Train Your Dragon in its fifth weekend, as How to Train Your Dragon has only been taking smaller drops in its week-over-week take. This week, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World took in $9.3 million. Assuming it follows a similar trend, next week we would see How to Train Your Dragon take in about $6 million. If Wonder Park takes just a 50% hit, that's $8 million. If it takes more than that, we could see Wonder Park already beneath How to Train Your Dragon on the top 10 countdown. For Wonder Park, though, this is on my list of films to take my daughter to see, as she's been asking to see the film ever since she saw the first trailer. I think with Wonder Park, though, they're trying to appeal to the Pixar audience as a film that offers a lot of fun and enjoyment, but has a bit of a somber undertone to it. So for those of you that don't know, Wonder Park's story is of June Bailey, a young girl, and her mother, who come up with the story of Wonderland, which is this magical amusement park run by animal creatures that entertain and delight children of all ages. But when June's mother, Mrs. Bailey, starts to get sick and is sent away for treatments, June becomes depressed and begins to take down the displays and refuses to play with other kids because she thinks they only care about her giving them Wonderland, as she's built a lot of the attractions in the backyard with her imagination. But when June goes off to camp to try and find other things to occupy her mind, she stumbles upon a roller coaster car which takes her to the Wonderland that she's created in her mind. And so it's left to the imagination of both the audience and young June just how much of what she's experiencing in Wonderland is something that she's actually experiencing, or something that's in her head being done as a coping mechanism to deal with everything that's going on in her life. But all that aside, Wonder Park looks like a really enjoyable film. I want to check it out, and of course my daughter does, so we'll be seeing it. But given the less than stellar grades on CinemaScore and Rotten Tomatoes, I worry that the word of mouth won't be favorable for Wonder Park, and we're going to see it quickly decline down the charts. So it's something that we'll have to check out sooner rather than later. But either way, I'm going to check out Wonder Park. It looks like it's a film that teaches you to maintain your creativity and your childlike nature, despite being in the face of some very adult, real-world problems.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.
So before we get into our number one this week, I want to welcome back Christopher Schiller to the show to get his thoughts on our opinion segment for this week. So, Chris, as I'm sure you're aware, earlier this week, Disney reinstated James Gunn as the director for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, essentially welcoming him back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe after he was dismissed late last year following resurfacing of some old tweets that he had made that were found to be offensive or in poor taste and bad attempts at humor. Chris, what are your thoughts on this matter and how Disney's handled it? I mean, it seems very odd that they were so adamant taking this stance against the controversial comments of James Gunn like 10 years ago, which in 10 years, I mean, I look at myself 10 years ago and I'm a vastly different person than I am now. And I feel that, he's probably the same way. But how do you feel about Disney welcoming James Gunn back into the fold of the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
It's a complex issue, and I do not envy Disney's position at all throughout the entire thing. I don't envy James Gunn's position at all throughout the whole thing either. But you have hit the nail on the head to some extent that who we were 10 years ago is different than who we are today. And if there's going to be growth of personal growth of any nature, you've got to be able to recognize that change happens from one point to another. And with James Gunn, he has admitted that years ago when he was early in his career, he was a provocateur. He would say things just to rattle the cages, not to diminish what he said or how it was taken. But once it was in the Twitterverse, it retained momentum, timing, and what is acceptable in both writing screenplays to sell and in what you said years ago and would it be acceptable to say today. Those things change, and he suffered the consequences of time catching up to those statements. He also suffered the consequences of being a target of what are considered internet trolls who dredged these matters up just to stir up trouble. They definitely dug for these elements and used them against him and used them against Disney to kind of put a stumbling block in a huge conglomerate that actually is so big and needs so much public face to look like the Disney image that it was difficult for them to do anything other than react at the time to, oh my goodness, those were horrible statements. We're going to have to do something that shows that we take this seriously, especially in the current political environment. It is very difficult for a corporation to stand on principle without damaging those who are decent individuals otherwise. James Gunn, by every account of how he apologized, how he took what Disney dictated to him and saying, this is what we have to do, he understood, he stepped aside, he allowed them to take the script that he was working on and said, here, I'll give this to you without any problem. I'll step away if that's what you want. He was sorry he'd said the things that he had said. He understands how it looks. He never got offended. He never got defensive. It was always apologetic. It was always in great face of someone who really understood the impact of what had happened. And you have to respect someone who can do that, who can say, I made a big mistake years ago, and today it is influencing the structure of the political discussion, and I'm going to take the brunt of this because I said it. I'm not denying I said it. I'm not trying to make excuses for what I said. I can explain the situation as to what I said. I was a different person 10 years ago, but I did say those things. And so he has taken that high road of, I did it, and these are the consequences. I will take them. The interesting thing about corporates, especially in the Me Too environment and in the structure of zero tolerance, you step into a place where the franchise has to die for you to fully accept the entire role that Disney was stepping towards, saying zero tolerance, James Gunn's out, that's it. The next stage is all of the actors of Guardians of the Galaxy that I've heard of were supportive of James Gunn, and they all said, we'll have to think about whether we want to move forward with this project with someone else. Every director that they interviewed to talk about Guardians of the Galaxy knew this was a hot box to step into. That's not something that's easy to step. It's not easy to step into a $100 million, $150 million picture when you're not the originator of anything and you have to take that and carry that mantle. It's a difficult road to hoe because you could be the one who stumbles and every eye would look at you. You're the change. You did it. Mm-hmm. How the people in the public respond has also been a reflection back to Disney saying, well, without James Gunn, it won't be the Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm not sure if I'm going to go see it. So you've got the actors in support of James Gunn. You've got the audience showing their doubts about anything that's done without James Gunn's influence. You've got Disney, who is just trying to react properly to the whole thing. Nobody's made a mistake here. Everybody's doing things properly and in support of the people that they believe in. And the franchise won't survive moving forward the way that it should. Now, you've got the question, is the franchise worth accepting the responsibility of somebody who has said something bad? I am heartened by the fact that Disney said, we'll reevaluate this decision. He's taken remorse. He's taken responsibility for what he said. He has apologized profusely. Maybe that's enough. And let's see if we can patch this back together and keep the franchise moving forward for Volume 3 and see if we can still make money as a corporation, because that's our bottom line, but still not lose face, because we did strike him. We did hit him on the wrist. We did say, naughty boy, you shouldn't have done that. So is that enough to appease those in Disney and those who watch Disney to say, yes, you've taken responsibility, but I'll still go see your movie because James Gunn is back and he's the only one who can really put this party together. Now, it turns out that I am rooting for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 to be a fine film, because I want James Gunn to be able to say, I am a better person today than I was 10 years ago. And I want Disney to be able to say, we respect the sensibilities of people today who take offense to those types of things that were said 10 years ago. We show that we properly give that consideration, but we are still a business and we can move forward without the zero tolerance, shutting the doors, killing everything off, which is the only other option. So we've got to find that happy middle ground, because corporate dollars have to be made. Some of that sounds cold when it's said out loud, but a lot of that is the situation we're in right now. Corporations have many hats to wear to serve their stockholders, their future, their licensing bids of all the films that they have in their vaults are all going to be affected. All of those factors are going to be affected by how they take this next step. And hopefully James Gunn wasn't just blowing smoke and he doesn't release new tweets that invert everything that he said, that he's fully remorseful. I doubt that that is the case. And I'm pulling for Guardians of the Galaxy 3 to be just as good as the first two films were, if not better, because there's a lot riding on it, both reputational-wise for Gunn and Disney and franchise-wise. And it affects an awful lot of stuff. I mean, yeah, it was a couple of tweets 10 years ago, and it's rattling this many cages. But there's got to be a way of being able to move forward with life. We don't just get one shot. We often find ourselves doing something wrong, stepping back, apologizing, moving forward, doing something right to make up for the times that we did things wrong. That's my personal opinion about it, is that we have to find some way of finding a road to the future through these bumps and distractions, paying the right respects, but also allowing people to grow as individuals.
In the interim between James Gunn's dismissal from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and now his being welcomed back, James Gunn took his talents elsewhere and landed himself at Warner Brothers with the DC Extended Universe and taking the helm and writing the script for what will be a sequel to the Suicide Squad. And because of Suicide Squad, this Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 that we've been talking about won't be actualized until the completion of this Suicide Squad sequel.
Disney is probably happier that Guardians of the Galaxy 3 will be delayed because it allows more time of recovery. They can say, yes, we punished him. Yes, we put him back on. But that was so long ago. And if Suicide Squad 2 does well, then they're going to be fabulously happy that Gunn is on Guardians of the Galaxy 3. But if Suicide Squad 2 fails, there's a lot of potential as to why that would have happened. But it puts Disney in the situation of, well, did we get now a dud? He may be replaced because they lose confidence in him as a director after a failure of Suicide Squad 2. Anything can happen.
And so one of the concerns that I had for James Gunn, for Disney, for Guardians was, okay, what if even James Gunn can't salvage whatever dumpster fire DC has waiting for him with the Suicide Squad? Does that then parlay itself into a hit on the success of Guardians possibly, or a hit on, the potential for James Gunn? Now it's not so much of who he is as a person, but who he is from a bankability standpoint.
Yeah, and it's part and parcel of the industry as it stands, is that no decision is a final yes, no decision is a final no in a company in this industry if you plan on staying in the industry for very long, because everything changes. Popularities change, performances change, audiences' tastes change, and you've got to roll with all of those elements. And hopefully you've got your finger on the right pulses to know the direction that you need it to be in the 2 years it takes or more to make one of these blockbuster films.
It almost at one point felt like it was two sports teams making a trade, because Disney seemed to trade James Gunn to Warner Brothers in DC, and in return, they got Will Smith to be a genie.
Actually, that used to be the way that the Hollywood system worked. You had contract players, and so they were constantly trading back and forth. So maybe we're going to a version of that at this higher level of studio, big film, moving the chess pieces around, trying to find something that works. I mean, we want to keep him, but you can borrow him for that one film as long as you don't tarnish him and bring him back to us with better cachet. Keep his name out there because we can't use him for 2 years, but bring him back over here when you're done.
So we'll have to see. I am interested to see how this story plays out with James Gunn, both with Suicide Squad 2 and then with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 following up shortly after. But for James Gunn, it seems that, for lack of a better way to put it, that all's forgiven. He's been welcomed back into the family of Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now we just have to hope that he doesn't need to make any more bad jokes.
Yeah. We have to make sure that he doesn't kick any puppies or do anything untoward.
All right, well, Chris, I'm going to finish up the countdown here with number one and talking about next week, but I want to thank you for contributing your thoughts and views on this matter with James Gunn.
Well, you're welcome. And anytime, I enjoy talking films. So, I would have probably had this conversation whether you were there or not. So I'm glad you were there.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you and I would have had this conversation whether there was a microphone in front of us or not. So I guess it's just better that we got it on microphone.
Yeah. And then other people can make fun of us for our opinions.
Exactly.
It'll live on the internet and we'll have to talk it down and apologize for it later.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you again, Chris. And I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And we'll talk soon.
You're listening to The Weekend Take. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks. Number 1.
And finally, at number 1 for the second weekend in a row is Captain Marvel from Buena Vista and Disney, taking in a massive $69.3 million for its second weekend, a 54.8% drop from last week. Its theater count didn't change. It held steady at 4,310 and still boasts an over $16,000 per screen average, as it brings its cume up to $266.2 million domestically in its second week of release, and has brought its worldwide cume up to $760.2 million after only 10 days in release. So for Captain Marvel and star Brie Larson, any idea of the social media backlash against what she said that we talked about at length last week seemingly does not affect the film. And I think that has more to do with the fact that this is a Marvel film than anything. I think if this were any other property that starred Brie Larson that wasn't Captain Marvel, that might have been enough to put a dent in its box office gross. But given the consistent audience interest in Captain Marvel and the growing interest leading up to Avengers Endgame, there really was no way that this film was poised to fail. And when looking at Captain Marvel in the pantheon of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which currently consists of 21 films, Captain Marvel, after only 10 days, finds itself at number 13. Next up on the list to overcome is Iron Man 2, which sits at $312 million, a number that I imagine by the time we'll report next week, it will have surpassed. If Captain Marvel's performance this coming week is anything like it was this past Monday through Thursday, and combined with a third weekend in release that I imagine will be somewhere around the $45 million mark, I certainly expect Captain Marvel to find itself living inside the top 10 all time for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Current projections have Captain Marvel finishing its run at just over $400 million, which means it could find itself living in the top 5 all-time of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That is to say, until Avengers Endgame comes out in April and likely obliterates every film on that chart and finds itself at number 1, currently held by Black Panther at $700 million. And for any of Brie Larson's detractors, you're just going to have to get used to it, as Brie Larson reportedly has signed on for anywhere between 6 and 8 Marvel films. And stepping off of the conversation that we just had with Christopher Schiller, discussing James Gunn and the reconciliation with Disney to bring him back into the fold of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there seems to be a bit of an attention deficit for us as a society. Sure, last week when Captain Marvel came out, all these people were all worked up over the comments and the requests that Brie Larson made, but it didn't stop it then. It's not stopping it now. And in light of much more pertinent and important stories that should be making headlines in the news, namely the recent terrorist attack in New Zealand killing 49 people, it seems that the request of a celebrity isn't as important anymore, is it? Asking for more diversity in the press junkets is not a matter of life and death, nearly as much as an actual matter of life and death. And so my main takeaway in the week since giving my soapbox rant on Captain Marvel and a lot of the societal problems that we have, and I've had to think about it and reflect on it, waking up to a headline of something as tragic as the recent terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in New Zealand certainly puts into perspective just how insignificant the opinions of a celebrity are. I just really hope that it gets through to people that what I report on, what we sit down in a dark room with a bunch of other people to watch, is meant to be entertainment. It's meant to be something to take us away from this world. And if we take away from that as entertainment, then we really have nothing left. Because if we can't enjoy art, if we can't enjoy these works of fiction to help us escape the reality and the gravity of what's going on in the world around us, then all we have left is the reality and the gravity of everything going on around us. We need to enjoy films for what they are at face value. They're entertainment. They're meant to take us away, to distract us, to make us laugh, to make us cry, to make us feel, to make us experience worlds outside of this one, deep into space, elsewhere in time, alternate universes, parallel dimensions. And if we take away any of that art form's enjoyment, if we raze it to the ground, and all we have left is this desolate, barren sense of depression and misery, then what do we have left? I don't mean to get all serious with everybody, but it really is horrendous to having just discussed last week, giving so much importance to not only what a celebrity said, but to the reaction of it. Because I can't tell you how many times some sort of tragedies happened, and I go to any news source, any viable news source, which is certainly up for debate in this day and age, and the headline had something to do with something sensational that a celebrity did. I just wish people would take account for what's important and prioritize a little bit better. This is meant to be fun. I do this show because I love movies. I do this show for fun. I don't take it so serious where I would ever put anything to do with any of these films as precedent over lives being lost. And so while I'll continue to report on topics beyond the numbers at the box office that have to do with the film industry, I just want everyone to know that it's in perspective to what's really important that's going on. And that if it's related to the films, it's related to entertainment, I'll discuss it here. But know that outside of this show, when I turn off this mic and when I turn everything off, that I still have a very real sense of what's going on. And that I choose typically not to bring it into here because much like the movies themselves, this is meant to be informative and entertainment. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, really, what I just said, but I just felt I had to say something on it. So for Captain Marvel, looking at the next week, I imagine if it follows a similar drop or even just a little bit less, it'll probably find itself around the $40 million mark for its third weekend in release. So talking about next week, the only wide release, as I mentioned, is Us from Jordan Peele and Universal, which will be opening on over 3,600 screens. And currently it's anticipated, as I mentioned, to open between $35 and $45 million, and will likely give Captain Marvel a run for its money in its third week of release. But that about wraps it up for us here this week on The Weekend Take. I want to thank Chris Schiller for stepping in and contributing his thoughts on the James Gunn and Disney topic. I also want to thank him for coming on to record the guest segment that he never got from being our first guest on the show for our first episode. I'm glad that we were able to do it, and I'm glad that I'll be able to share it with you all so you can learn more about Chris The Weekend Take is on social media as well. We're on Twitter at Weekend Take. We're on Facebook at www.facebook.com/The Weekend Take. And please check out our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/The Weekend Take, where for as little as $1, you can become a patron of The Weekend Take and get exclusive access to extended cuts of the episodes if you want to hear more of the conversation had this week and any of the previous weeks with some of our guests. So until next week, I hope you all enjoy your week ahead, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
You've been listening to The Weekend Take. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and Google Play and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Visit our Patreon page to become a patron of The Weekend Take, and for as little as $1, you'll receive exclusive content and perks.